It is 3 in the morning, and you are awake. You are not sure what woke you. There was no noise. Nothing hurts. But your mouth is completely dry, your tongue is stuck to the roof of your mouth, and your throat feels like sandpaper. There is a glass of water on the bedside table, because at some point, over the last few years, you started keeping one there, without ever deciding to. You drink. You lie back down. And you tell yourself it is the heating, or the season, or the fact that you are not 25 anymore. It is none of those things. For the last 7 hours, your body has been running on its emergency airway, not the one it was built to use. The backup. The one designed for the moments when you are sprinting, or shouting, or your nose is blocked, and evolution decided you needed a second option. You have been using the second option all night, and you have probably been using it a good part of the day as well. And the consequences of that are not the small cosmetic ones you would expect. They reach into how much oxygen actually gets delivered to your brain, how wide the blood vessels in your lungs open, how your airway behaves while you sleep, and how tired you feel at 4 in the afternoon, for no reason you can identify. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what your nose is doing, that your mouth cannot do, why the most important gas in this entire story is not oxygen, and what genuinely changes in a week of deliberate nasal breathing. I am also going to tell you what does not change. Because the single most popular intervention on the internet for this problem is one that I think a lot of people should not be doing. And I will show you exactly why. If this kind of thing is what you want more of, following along takes 2 seconds, and it means the next time we take something apart at this level, you are already here. Now, before I explain what your nose does, I have to take apart what you believe breathing is for. Because almost everyone carries the same mental model. That model is wrong, and none of the rest of this makes sense until it is replaced. Here is the model most people have. Breathing is how you get oxygen into your body. More air in means more oxygen. More oxygen means more energy, better function, better everything. Under that model, the mouth is simply a bigger opening than the nose, so if anything, the mouth should be better. That model is wrong at the very first step. Right now, sitting still, breathing normally, the hemoglobin in your arteries is somewhere around 97 to 98% saturated with oxygen. That is not a target you are working towards. That is where you already are, at rest, without effort, on ordinary air. Which means there is almost nothing left to fill. If you breathe deeper, faster, harder, through a wider opening, you cannot get meaningfully above that. There is no room. You might reach 99. The extra oxygen you fought for has nowhere to go. So the amount of oxygen you take in is not the limiting factor in how much oxygen your body actually uses. It has not been the limiting factor at any point today. The limiting factor is release. It is not how much oxygen you load onto the red blood cell at the lungs. It is how willing that red blood cell is to let go of the oxygen when it arrives at your brain, your heart, your working muscle. And what governs that release is not oxygen at all. It is carbon dioxide. I am going to come back to that, and when I do, it is going to reframe the entire topic. But first I need to show you what the organ in the middle of your face actually is, because I suspect you think of it as a hole. It is not a hole. It is one of the most structurally elaborate pieces of tissue in your head. Let me give you the number that made this land for me. You take somewhere around 20,000 breaths in a day, roughly 8 million in a year. If you are 50 years old, you have done this something like 400 million times, 400 million repetitions of a process, and almost none of them were conscious decisions, which means a very small difference in how each one is performed, multiplied across 400 million events, is not a small difference at all. Here is another one, and this is the fact that I think is genuinely strange once you sit with it. Your 2 nostrils are not doing the same job right now. One of them is doing most of the work, while the other is partially congested, and in roughly 2 to 4 hours they will swap. This is called the nasal cycle. It was described by a physiologist named Richard Kaiser back in 1895, and it is controlled by your autonomic nervous system, swelling and shrinking the tissue inside one side of your nose and then the other, around the clock, for your entire life. Nobody knows for certain why. The leading explanation is that it allows one side to rest and recover its mucus lining while the other side handles airflow. But whatever the reason, it tells you something important. Your nose is not passive plumbing. It has actively regulated tissue with its own control system, and it is being adjusted continuously by your nervous system without your knowledge. So what is it doing with all that machinery? Start with the physical structure. Inside each side of your nose are 3 scroll-shaped shelves of bone covered in soft tissue, called turbinates. They spiral inward, and they force the air coming in to turn, slow down, and spread out across a large surface rather than shooting straight through. That surface is coated in a thin layer of mucus, and underneath the mucus is a carpet of microscopic hairs called cilia that beat in a coordinated wave, roughly 10 to 15 times per second, moving the mucus steadily backwards towards your throat where it gets swallowed. Now watch what that arrangement accomplishes in the time it takes air to travel about 10 centimeters. Air enters at whatever the room temperature is. By the time it reaches the back of your throat, it has been warmed to close to body temperature and humidified to somewhere near 90% relative humidity. On a cold morning, that means air at near freezing is brought up by 30 degrees or more in a fraction of a second, using nothing but the blood flowing through the tissue of your nose. Why does that matter? Because the delicate gas exchange surface deep in your lungs, the alveoli, only works properly when it is wet. Dry air reaching that tissue impairs the function of the cilia lining the airway, thickens secretions, and irritates the lining. Your nose exists in part so that your lungs never have to meet outside air in its raw state. At the same time, the mucus and the cilia and the coarse hairs at the entrance are trapping particles: dust, pollen, bacteria, fungal spores, pollution. The turning, slowing airflow makes particles collide with the sticky surface rather than continuing into the lung. It is a filter that cleans itself continuously and never needs replacing. Your mouth does none of this. Not one part of it. Air taken in through the mouth arrives at your lower airway at whatever temperature and humidity the room happens to be, carrying whatever was floating in it. And then there is the part that sounds like a flaw until you understand it. Breathing through your nose is harder than breathing through your mouth. The nasal airway accounts for roughly half of the total resistance in your entire respiratory system. That resistance is not an engineering failure. It is doing work. The resistance slows your exhale. Slowing the exhale keeps a slightly higher pressure in the airways for longer, which helps keep the small airways and air sacs open rather than collapsing at the end of each breath. It gives the blood passing through your lungs more time in contact with air. And it makes it physically harder to overbreathe, which, as you are about to see, is the entire crux of this subject. So that is the mechanical case: filter, humidifier, heater, and a deliberately restricted valve. All of that is real, all of it is uncontroversial, and none of it is the most interesting thing your nose does. In 1991, a group of researchers at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, the institution that awards the Nobel Prize in Medicine, found something they were not looking for. They were measuring exhaled gases, and they detected nitric oxide coming out of human airways in quantities that did not make sense. Nitric oxide is a gas, 2 atoms. And in 1998, 3 researchers, Robert Furchgott, Louis Ignarro, and Farid Murad, received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for establishing that this simple gas acts as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. Its central job is to tell the smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels to relax, which widens the vessel and lets blood through more easily. What the Karolinska team, including John Lundberg and Eddie Weitzberg, went on to establish is where the nitric oxide in the airway was coming from. It was not the lungs. It was being produced continuously in the paranasal sinuses, the air-filled chambers in the bone around your nose and eyes, and released into the nasal airway. So here's what happens on a nasal breath. Air comes in through the nostrils, passes over tissue that is steadily releasing nitric oxide, picks it up, and carries it down into the lungs. And when that nitric oxide arrives in the lungs, it does 2 things. It relaxes the smooth muscle in the airways, which means it acts as a mild bronchodilator, opening the passages, and it relaxes the smooth muscle in the pulmonary blood vessels, widening the vessels that carry blood through the lung tissue. That second effect is the important one, and it is subtle. Widening the blood vessels in the parts of the lung that are receiving air improves what physiologists call ventilation-perfusion matching. It means blood is directed towards the regions of lung that actually have air in them, rather than being distributed evenly across regions that are working and regions that are not. Better matching means better oxygen uptake from the same breath. Now the key point. This gas is produced in your sinuses and delivered through your nose. Breathe through your mouth and you bypass the entire delivery system. The nitric oxide is still being made. It just never reaches your lungs. There is a detail here that I find delightful and that has held up in the research. In 2002, Weitzberg and Lundberg published a study in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine showing that humming dramatically increases the amount of nitric oxide released from the sinuses into the nasal airway. The vibration appears to help flush gas out of the sinus chambers, and the increase they measured was on the order of 15-fold compared with quiet exhalation. I want to be careful about how far that gets stretched, because it does get stretched. What that study demonstrated is a large, measurable, repeatable increase in nasal nitric oxide during humming. What it did not demonstrate is a set of downstream health outcomes from humming as a daily practice. Those are two different claims, and you will see the first one used to sell you the second. The mechanism is real. The clinical evidence for humming as therapy is thin. I would rather tell you that than let you find out later. Now let us go back to carbon dioxide, because this is where the whole subject turns over. Everyone treats carbon dioxide as waste. You produce it, you exhale it. It is the exhaust from the engine. And that framing is not wrong exactly, but it is so incomplete that it leads people to the opposite of the truth. In 1904, a Danish physiologist named Christian Bohr described a relationship that now carries his name, the Bohr Effect. It works like this. Hemoglobin, the protein in your red blood cells that carries oxygen, does not hold on to oxygen with a fixed grip. Its grip changes depending on the local chemical environment. When hemoglobin arrives somewhere with a high concentration of carbon dioxide and a slightly more acidic environment, its shape changes and its affinity for oxygen drops. It lets go more readily. That is not a defect. That is the delivery mechanism. Think about where carbon dioxide is highest in your body. It is highest exactly where tissue is working hardest and burning the most fuel, because carbon dioxide is what that burning produces. So the tissue that most needs oxygen is generating the very signal that makes hemoglobin release oxygen there. It is an elegant self-targeting system. The oxygen gets dropped off where the exhaust is thickest, which is the same place the demand is highest. Now invert it. What happens if your carbon dioxide levels are chronically lower than they should be? Hemoglobin holds on tighter. Oxygen stays bound. Your arterial saturation can read a perfectly healthy 98% on a fingertip monitor, while less of that oxygen is actually being unloaded into your tissue. And there is a second consequence that is even more direct. Carbon dioxide is itself a vasodilator, particularly in the blood vessels of the brain. Drop your carbon dioxide and the arteries supplying your brain constrict, reducing cerebral blood flow. You already know what this feels like, because you have done it. Breathe fast and hard for 30 seconds, and you get lightheaded, tingly, and slightly detached. People assume that is too much oxygen. It is not. You cannot meaningfully raise your oxygen saturation. What has happened is that you blew off too much carbon dioxide. Your cerebral arteries narrowed, and your brain briefly received less blood. That is hyperventilation in its acute, obvious form. The version that matters for this video is the chronic, invisible form. Breathing slightly too much, all day, for years. Never dramatic enough to notice. Just consistently a bit more air than metabolic demand requires, which keeps carbon dioxide sitting at the low end of normal, which subtly tightens hemoglobin's grip and narrows cerebral vessels around the clock. And the single easiest way to breathe slightly too much, continuously, without noticing, is to breathe through a large, unrestricted opening instead of a narrow, resistant, regulated one. That is the connection. The nose does not just filter and humidify and deliver nitric oxide. Its resistance is a governor on your breathing volume. It makes overbreathing physically harder to do. Now, sleep, because this is where the consequences concentrate. When you fall asleep, the muscles that hold your upper airway open relax. That is normal, and it happens to everybody. The question is, what the geometry of your airway looks like once they do. When your mouth is closed, your lower jaw sits forward in its normal resting position, and your tongue rests against the roof of your mouth. When your mouth falls open during sleep, the jaw rotates backwards and down, and the tongue drops back towards the throat with it. That narrows the space behind the tongue at exactly the moment when the muscles keeping it open have gone slack. Research using imaging and airway pressure measurement has repeatedly found that the upper airway is more prone to collapse during mouth breathing than during nasal breathing. And studies in people with obstructive sleep apnea have generally found that breathing route affects the severity of obstruction. Mouth breathing during sleep is associated with a more collapsible airway, more snoring, and in people who already have sleep, disordered breathing, worse events. Then there are the effects you can feel in the morning. Saliva is not just for digestion, it buffers acid, and it carries antibacterial and antifungal compounds that keep the ecology of your mouth in check. Sleeping with an open mouth dries the entire surface for 7 or 8 hours a night. The documented consequences include increased dental decay, gum inflammation, and bad breath in the morning that brushing before bed does not fix. That glass of water on the bedside table is not a fact about your bedroom. It is a symptom. So, this is the point in almost every video on this topic where you get told to tape your mouth shut at night, and I am not going to do that. And I want to explain exactly why. Mouth taping has become the signature intervention of this entire subject. It is cheap, it is simple, it makes a good thumbnail, and the logic is obvious. If mouth breathing at night is the problem, close the mouth. Here is the problem with the logic. Your mouth falling open during sleep is very often not the cause. It is the compensation. If you cannot move enough air through your nose because of a deviated septum, enlarged turbinates, chronic allergic inflammation, or nasal polyps, your body opens your mouth to get air. That is your airway solving a problem. Taping it shut does not fix the nasal obstruction. It removes the solution while leaving the obstruction in place. And in the group that matters most, this gets serious. In someone with undiagnosed obstructive sleep apnea, the mouth is a genuine escape route during an obstructive event. The research base for mouth taping is small, the studies are mostly tiny, and the reviews that have looked at it have concluded that the evidence of benefit is weak, while the potential for harm in people with undiagnosed obstruction is real. So my position on it is this. Taping your mouth is an intervention aimed at a symptom, promoted well beyond what the evidence supports, and specifically risky for the people who most need help. If you snore heavily, if you wake gasping, if anyone has ever observed you stop breathing in your sleep, or if you are excessively sleepy during the day, the appropriate next step is a sleep assessment, not a roll of tape. There is a second overclaim I want to deal with while we are here, because it is everywhere. You will see the argument that nasal breathing reshapes your face. The version aimed at adults promises a stronger jawline and better facial structure. Here is what is actually established. In children, during the years when the facial skeleton is still growing, chronic mouth breathing is genuinely associated with altered craniofacial development, a narrower upper jaw, a higher arched palate, dental crowding, and a longer facial pattern. That association is well documented in the pediatric and orthodontic literature, and it is a real reason to take mouth breathing in a child seriously and get the cause investigated. What is not established is that any of that reverses in an adult. Once the growth plates of the facial skeleton have fused, the bone is not being remodeled by tongue posture. Adults who adopt nasal breathing report feeling better. There is no good evidence that their facial bones move. Which brings me to the promise in the title of this video, and I want to answer it directly rather than let it sit there. What actually happens in 1 week? Realistically, here is what people notice inside 7 days. The dry mouth on waking goes, often within a few nights, because the mechanism is immediate. Morning throat irritation settles. Many people find their nose feels less blocked by the end of the week, which sounds paradoxical, but reflects something real, that consistent nasal airflow helps maintain the patency of the passage, while chronic disuse allows the tissue to stay congested. Some people report sleeping through the night, rather than waking at 3 in the morning. And during light exercise, the sense of breathlessness at a given easy pace often eases as tolerance to carbon dioxide begins to shift. Here is what does not happen in 1 week. Your carbon dioxide set point does not fully recalibrate. That is a process measured in weeks to months. Sleep apnea does not resolve. Structural nasal obstruction does not resolve. Your face does not change. So does your body reverse itself in a week. Some things genuinely begin to. Others need considerably longer, and a few need a clinician rather than a habit. I would rather you go in with the accurate version, because the accurate version is still a good enough reason to do it. If this is the kind of breakdown you find useful, saving this video now means you can come back to the protocol later. It is coming up shortly, and it is simpler than you are expecting. Who does this matter most for? Anyone who wakes with a dry mouth or a sore throat. Anyone who has been told they snore. Anyone with unexplained afternoon fatigue that does not track with how much they slept. Anyone who gets recurring dental problems despite good hygiene. Because the drying of the mouth overnight is a genuine and under-recognized contributor. Anyone who finds easy exercise disproportionately breathless. And any parent of a child who habitually sleeps with their mouth open, where the case for getting it assessed is much stronger than it is in adults, precisely because the facial skeleton is still forming. Now, the honest limits of all this. Much of what I have described sits at different levels of evidential strength, and they should not be treated as equal. The conditioning functions of the nose, the production of nitric oxide in the sinuses, and the Bohr effect are established physiology, taught in medical schools, not in dispute. The relationship between breathing route and upper airway collapsibility during sleep is well supported. The link between chronic mouth breathing and craniofacial development in children is supported by a substantial observational literature, though observational studies of children are difficult to fully control. Where things get thinner is the leap from these mechanisms to specific promised outcomes from breathing retraining in healthy adults. There, the trials are smaller, the outcome measures are more subjective, and the field has a real problem with commercial interest, because there is a large industry selling breathing courses, tapes, and devices. Mechanistic plausibility is not the same as demonstrated benefit, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Before the protocol, the cautions. If you genuinely cannot breathe through your nose, this is not a discipline problem, and willpower will not solve it. See an ear, nose and throat specialist. Deviated septum, turbinate hypertrophy, polyps and chronic allergic rhinitis are all treatable, and treating them is the actual first step. If you have asthma, do not attempt to restrict breathing during symptoms, and follow your own management plan. If you have any suspicion of sleep apnea, get assessed before adopting any nighttime intervention. Never practice breath holding in or near water, and never while driving. If you have cardiovascular disease, uncontrolled hypertension, epilepsy, or you are pregnant, get individual guidance before doing any breath hold work at all. Now, what to actually do. 4 things, in order of importance. The first is daytime awareness, and it matters more than anything you do at night. Lips together, teeth slightly apart, tongue resting on the roof of your mouth, breathing through your nose. Set a reminder a few times a day for the first week, and simply check where your mouth is. Most people are astonished by how often it is open when they are concentrating, reading, or watching something. The second is to breathe through your nose during easy exercise. Walking is the right place to start. Go at a pace at which you can maintain nasal breathing comfortably, and hold that pace even if it feels slower than you would like. Over a few weeks, the pace at which you can stay nasal will rise. That rising pace is the visible sign that your tolerance to carbon dioxide is shifting, and it is the most reliable feedback you will get that anything is changing. The third is slow breathing, a few minutes a day. In through the nose, out through the nose, with the exhale longer than the inhale, at somewhere around 5 to 6 breaths per minute. Not deep, not forceful, quiet and small. The goal here is the opposite of what most people assume it is. You are not trying to take in more air, you are trying to need less. The fourth is to fix the mechanical problem if you have one. If your nose is blocked most of the time, everything above is being attempted with the handbrake on. Get it looked at. That is the whole protocol. Nothing to buy, no tape, no device, no subscription. So come back to 3 in the morning. You are awake, your mouth is dry, and there is a glass of water on the table that you never consciously decided to put there. What that glass is recording is not the dryness of the room. It is 7 hours of air arriving raw, unconditioned and unfiltered, with none of the nitric oxide that was being manufactured a few centimeters away in the bones of your face and never collected. It is a jaw sitting further back than it was designed to sit, and a tongue resting closer to your airway than it should be. And it is a system that has been quietly working around a problem for so long that the workaround stopped looking like a workaround and started looking like your normal. You take 20,000 of these breaths tomorrow, whatever you decide. You have already taken hundreds of millions of them. The only real question is whether they go through the organ that was built for the job.